Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. And so we're into the final half term of this academic year. And indeed, it's the final half term of my time as an ECT. So from next year, I'll have to change the description of this podcast. It's been a wild ride. I'll do a bit of a roundup of my time as an ECT at the end of this year, so in a couple of months' time. In the meantime, however, I've got two things to discuss. It'll be a shorter one today. Just two things to discuss. The first thing, I would like to acknowledge how well my Year 7 class did on their recent assessment. This is a class who haven't really had a steady maths teacher since December. So the maths teacher that they started the year with left the school. And the teacher who was going to take over has been poorly. So I stepped in several months ago now. But even once I stepped in, I was only teaching them twice a week. Two of those lessons were still cover lessons. So this class has been hit really hard with cover. And even when I am in the room with them, so when they do have a maths teacher in with them, they can be a handful. I love them to bits, but lessons are often disrupted. Yet against all the odds, they sat their assessment in the last week or so, and I am so proud of them. You know, when marking those assessments, and I told them this, when marking those assessments, I even got a little bit emotional. It was on a question about ordering decimals. So they had a string of different decimal numbers, and they had to put them in order. And there's me marking this question, getting emotional. How absurd. The reason I got emotional is because I taught them in the build-up to the assessment, when we were doing some revision lessons, I taught them a rather distinctive way of doing these questions, which they hadn't seen before. You stack all of your decimal numbers on top of one another, and then compare the digits down the columns in order to work out which is the smallest, which is the biggest, etc. And you know what? When I was marking those questions, most, if not all of them, had stacked those darn decimals on top of one another. So, through all the chaos, and despite all the cover work, and despite the odds being set against them, those students had listened to what I was saying, they'd remembered it, and they had put it to good use in an assessment, and they had picked up lots of marks on this question, and I'm so pleased with them. And when I was handing out the assessments after I'd marked them, and I was telling them how happy I was, I gave an assessment back to this one student in particular. He'd done the best in the class, and he was so excited and so happy with how well he'd done that he was sat at the back of the room. He jumped up spontaneously, ran to the front of the classroom, and did a dance for all of us. And it was wonderful. His dance expressed just how I was feeling, and I think there were lots of other students in the room who were feeling similarly. A very athletic dance as well. I was incredibly impressed. I really was. So that was a wonderful experience. I find myself getting far more emotionally invested with classes like this one. Classes full of characters, lower attaining classes, classes who've had to overcome the odds, so in this case having to overcome a great deal of cover lessons, I find myself far more emotionally invested. And when they do well, it means so much. And so I'm very happy and I'm incredibly proud of my students. And I really did love that dance. Now, the second thing, the main thing probably that I wanted to discuss today, has to do with relatedness. Now, I'll return to that term in a minute. I'll start by saying that being a teacher is a bit of a performance. It's a profession, so it's a professional performance. However, because it's this professional performance, it can end up being a bit of a facade. By putting on this performance as a professional teacher, no matter how good and convincing the performance may be, it puts up a barrier between you and whoever you're teaching. And at the same time, the children themselves, the young people themselves, are also expected to put on a performance, a professional performance. Indeed, we make them wear professional little uniforms, and they're expected to behave like students. You know, that's another professional role. So we've got teachers who are performing one sort of professional role and putting up their facade, and students who are being expected to perform their sort of professional role and, again, putting up another facade. So we've kind of got this double layer of barriers in between people, actual people, the people behind those roles. And yet at the same time, again and again and again, we hear how important it is to build positive relationships. Well, with all those facades and performances and professional aspects of the role, it can be really difficult to penetrate through all that and make a personal connection. And yet every so often students, and you know what? More often than not, this seems to be the behaviourally challenged, let's say, students. Every so often, they'll ask a penetrating question, a question that seems to break through all of the pretense and goes in search of the person behind the performance. So in this last week, for example, I was asked whether I watched the boxing. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but I've had conversations with students about boxing before because I do enjoy watching the boxing. And this particular student asked me if I watched the boxing. Indeed, I had. We had a conversation about the boxing. Later in the week, I had another student ask me out of the blue whether I watched anime. And you know what? As it happens, I'm currently watching the second season of One Punch Man, so I do watch anime. And I had quite a good conversation with that student about anime. Now, what does this have to do with relatedness? Well, relatedness is, according to self-determination theory, relatedness is one of 3 innate psychological needs that we all have. The other 2 are autonomy and competence. And so we all have this innate psychological need for relatedness. That means personal connections. And so when a student asks you a question like, did you watch the boxing? Or do you like anime? Or anything else like that, a personal question rather than a professional one. If a student asks you that sort of question, that's them trying to satisfy their own need for relatedness. It's an innate need that's built into all of us. And they're reaching out to you to try to make that personal connection so that they can satisfy that need within themselves. Now, self-determination theory is ultimately a theory of human motivation. So the idea is that if someone has each of these 3 innate psychological needs satisfied, then they will be properly motivated. Or they'll be motivated in a far better way than if those 3 psychological needs are frustrated or unsatisfied. And I must say, I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I must say that I think the best teachers are the best motivators. The best teachers satisfy each of these 3 innate psychological needs in their students. They satisfy the need for autonomy by making students feel like they have options and choices and that they're directing their own learning, at least to an extent. They make students feel competent by delivering excellent explanations and ensuring that students know exactly what it is they need to do. And they make students feel like they have a sense of belonging. So that's the relatedness psychological need. They have that, but they somehow, through all the performances and facades of professional teaching, they break through it all and form that personal connection. And so when you have these students, like I said, perhaps the behaviourally challenged ones, I do find it's those who seem to ask the personal questions more often. When they ask those questions, they're trying to make a personal connection. At the same time, they are trying to satisfy their own need for relatedness. And on another level, they are ultimately asking you to help them become properly motivated. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for motivation. And indeed, there is a very strong connection between being properly motivated and having good psychological well-being. And I thought it was important to mention all this because there have been occasions where a student has asked me a question like that and I've kind of brushed it off. Either I haven't had time. Well, actually, that's it. It's pretty much always because I feel I haven't got time. You know, it's a busy profession being a teacher. And I don't always feel I have time to answer those personal questions. But reflecting on it now, I think it is incredibly important to do so. Not only for the purposes of education and helping students build those personal connections so that they can feel properly motivated to learn, but also just for the sake of making the personal connections themselves. I think those are inherently valuable. And they make the whole experience of teaching and learning a more enjoyable and more valuable one. So there you go, that's relatedness. Only a short episode today, like I said. Before I go, my usual Patreon plea. So this episode took just over an hour to produce. Usually they take 2 hours to produce. And I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. So if you think that that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, that's £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you sign up on Patreon, you will also get exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. So if that appeals to you, then yes, please go and sign up on Patreon. As always, the link is in the show notes, and we will talk again soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you and talk again soon.